The darkness broke slowly like ice melting under a weak sun. Jake Harrison felt his lungs burn as they pulled in air for the first time in 10,000 years. His eyes refused to open at first and his body felt heavy like stone. The gel that had preserved him drained away through tubes he could hear but not see. Somewhere nearby a machine beeped steadily and a soft voice spoke words he could not yet understand. When his eyes finally opened, the world was blurred and white. Lights hung above him, too bright and too cold. He tried to move his hand and found it responded, but slowly, as if his muscles had forgotten their purpose. The voice came again, and this time he understood it. The medical pod was asking him questions about his condition. He tried to answer but only managed a weak groan. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt strange and elastic. Gradually his vision cleared and he could see the inside of the cryogenic bay. Hundreds of pods lined the walls, each one containing a sleeping human. Some were beginning their revival sequences with lights blinking green and amber. Others remained dark and silent. Jake wondered how many had survived the long sleep. A figure moved into his line of sight. It was Lisa Martinez, and she looked as confused and weak as he felt. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, and her eyes were wide with uncertainty. She reached out and touched his pod, and he saw her mouth move but heard nothing through the transparent shell. The pod hissed and the cover slid back. Cold air rushed in, making him shiver. Lisa helped him sit up, though she looked barely strong enough to stand herself. They did not speak at first because speech seemed too difficult a task. Around them more pods were opening and more crew members were waking. Some coughed violently. Others lay still and quiet. A few managed to climb out of their pods on shaking legs. Jake forced himself to stand. His knees nearly buckled, but he grabbed the edge of the pod and held on. The ship's AI system called Oracle activated screens all around the bay. Data scrolled past too fast to read, but Jake caught glimpses of words that made his heart sink. Course deviation was massive. Fuel reserves were critical. Unknown energy signatures detected nearby. System location unknown. Daniel Cross stumbled over to them looking pale and sick. He was their medical officer, but right now he looked like he needed a doctor himself. He tried to speak but had to stop and cough. When he finally managed words, his voice was rough and broken. He said they needed to check everyone for revival complications. Some pods showed warning indicators. Some people might not wake up at all. Emma Blake was already at a computer terminal despite having just climbed from her pod. She was their tactical officer, and even in her weakened state she was trying to understand what had happened to their ship. Her fingers moved slowly across the controls, pulling up navigation data and sensor readings. What she found made her curse softly. Jake made his way to her side, moving carefully because his legs still did not fully obey him. He looked at the screen and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. They were nowhere near their planned destination. The star charts showed nothing familiar, and the sensor data showed things that should not exist. Massive structures in space. Energy readings that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. Ships or stations so large they registered as small moons. Oracle began a status report in its calm, measured voice. The ship Valkyrie had suffered a navigation computer failure 8,000 years into their journey. Course corrections had been attempted, but without human oversight, they had been inadequate. The ship had drifted far from its intended path. Fuel meant for controlled deceleration had been spent trying to maintain system functionality. They were now in an unknown region of space with barely enough power to sustain life support, but that was not the worst news. Oracle displayed sensor data from the past century. The passive scanners had been recording everything even while the crew slept. What they showed was impossible. Radio transmissions in the hundreds. Electromagnetic signatures consistent with advanced technology. Multiple distinct sources suggesting multiple civilizations. And most shocking of all signs of recent conflict, just 3 star systems. Away. Lisa pulled up the communications data and set Oracle to analyzing it. The AI worked through the recordings, identifying patterns and attempting translation. The task would take hours, but preliminary results were already appearing. The transmissions were definitely artificial and definitely intelligent. Someone was out there. Many someones? Jake called for all senior officers to gather once they could walk. It took 2 hours before enough people had recovered to hold a proper meeting. They assembled in the command center, which was small and cramped because the Valkyrie had been built for long-term sleep, not active operations. 16 people crowded into a space meant for 8. Emma presented the tactical situation first. The nearby conflict showed energy signatures consistent with weapons fire, but the patterns were strange. The exchanges happened at long range and followed what seemed like predetermined timing. Ships maneuvered slowly and deliberately. It looked almost ceremonial. Nothing like the desperate, brutal battles humanity had fought before leaving Earth. Peter Grant, their xenobiologist, offered his thoughts next. If these were alien civilizations, then humanity had finally found proof they were not alone in the universe. But the question was, what kind of aliens? Were they friendly? Were they hostile? Would they even recognize humans as intelligent life? He recommended extreme caution in any first contact scenario. Keela Rogers, their diplomatic officer, agreed. She had been trained for this exact situation, though no one had really expected it to happen. First contact protocols existed, but they had been written assuming humanity would be the stronger party. Now they were the ones who were lost and desperate. They needed information and resources. They needed help. That put them in a weak negotiating position. Jake listened to all of them and then made his decision. They would move closer to the nearest concentration of activity. They would observe and learn before revealing themselves. The Valkyrie's stealth systems were primitive by the standards of the technology. They were seeing, but perhaps primitive enough to go unnoticed. They would creep forward slowly and carefully. Lisa warned that their fuel situation was critical. Any maneuvering would drain reserves they could not replace. If they committed to this course, there would be no turning back. They would have to make contact eventually, whether they wanted to or not. Jake acknowledged the risk but saw no alternative. Staying where they were meant slow death as systems failed one by one. The Valkyrie's engines fired for the first time in 10,000 years. The thrust was gentle and carefully controlled. The ship began moving toward the massive space station that orbited a blue giant star. As they drew closer, Oracle continued decoding transmissions, and what it translated made everyone in the command center fall silent. The aliens were discussing trade agreements and cultural exchanges. They were debating the rules of their ritualized combat. They were complaining about taxes and entertainment and the quality of their meals. They sounded almost human in their petty concerns. But more importantly, they sounded peaceful. War in the sense that humanity understood it seemed to be absent from their conversations. Emma said what everyone was thinking. These civilizations had forgotten how to fight real wars. They had grown soft and comfortable. She did not say the rest of what she was thinking, but Jake could see it in her eyes. If it came to conflict, humanity would have an advantage that no one in this galaxy could match. They remembered what war really meant. The Valkyrie continued its approach, and Jake wondered what would happen when they finally made contact. Would these peaceful aliens welcome humanity, or would they fear what humans represented? 10,000 years ago, his species had been tearing itself apart. Now they were entering a galaxy that had somehow found peace. He was not sure which frightened him more. The space station was larger than anything Jake had ever imagined. It stretched across the viewport like a small city hanging in the void. Towers and domes connected by tubes and bridges created a structure so complex it hurt to look at for too long. Lights flickered across its surface in patterns that might have been windows or might have been something else entirely. Ships moved around it like insects around a hive, and each ship was itself. Massive enough to dwarf the Valkyrie, Oracle had been monitoring communications for 3 days now and had managed partial translations of 5 different languages. The station was called Harmonious Exchange, and it served as a trading hub for 17 different species. The dominant power in this region was something called the Zephan Concordat, which seemed to be a coalition rather than a single government. They had maintained order here for 3,000 years. Jake made the decision to announce their presence. Continuing to hide seemed pointless and possibly dangerous. If they were discovered skulking around, it would create suspicion. Better to approach openly and hope for the best? He had Oracle prepare a simple message in the mathematical language that scientists had always assumed would be universal. We come in peace. We seek communication. We need help. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every transmission frequency suddenly carried messages directed at them. The station's traffic control contacted them. Military vessels moved to intercept. Scientific stations demanded data. Oracle struggled to filter and translate the flood of information. The tone seemed more excited than hostile, but it was hard to be certain. A Zephan official made contact and Oracle translated its message. The official identified itself as Click Thought Harmony and requested the Valkyrie dock at a quarantine bay. Jake agreed because he had little choice. The station's defense systems were powering up, and he had no desire to test them. Lisa guided the ship in carefully conserving every drop of fuel. The quarantine bay was enormous, and empty except for their small ship. Docking clamps engaged gently, and the station's systems connected to theirs. Jake assembled a contact team. Kayla would lead because that was her job. Emma would come for security. Peter would provide scientific expertise. And Jake would be there because a captain should face the unknown alongside his crew. They wore their oldest EVA suits because nothing else had survived the long sleep intact. The suits were bulky and primitive-looking, but they worked. The airlock cycled, and they stepped into a corridor that had been hastily adapted for their size. Everything looked slightly wrong, as if designed by someone who understood the function but not the form of human spaces. The Zephan were waiting in a large chamber. Click Thought Harmony stood in the center, flanked by dozens of other beings. The Zephan looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a person standing upright on 4 legs with 2 arms and a head. That was mostly eyes and mandibles. Its carapace was a deep blue color, and it moved with a grace that seemed almost like dancing. Beside the Zephan stood representatives of other species, a being made of what looked like crystal that reflected light in rainbow patterns. Something that might have been a plant or might have been an animal with vines for limbs. A creature that floated in a tank of liquid atmosphere. And others that defied easy description. Kyla stepped forward and began speaking while Oracle translated. She explained what humans were and where they had come from. She told them about Earth and the long sleep and the desperate flight from a dying world. She kept her explanation simple and factual. The aliens listened in what seemed like stunned silence. Click Thought Harmony responded, and its words sent a chill through the human delegation. Humans were not unknown. They were myths. Ancient ruins on dozens of worlds showed evidence of human presence, but most species believed humans had either gone extinct or ascended to some higher existence. Finding living, breathing humans was like finding dinosaurs still walking around. It should not be possible. Peter asked about the ruins, and the Zephan brought up holographic images. They showed structures that were undeniably human in design. Bases on airless moons. Mining operations on asteroids. Even the remnants of what looked like terraforming equipment on a handful of planets. All of it abandoned. All of it millions of years old, according to the dating methods the Zephan used. Jake felt his mind rebel against the implications. Millions of years. That was impossible. Humans had only left Earth 10,000 years ago. Unless time dilation had been more severe than they calculated. Unless something had gone wrong with their clocks. Unless the galaxy had somehow moved faster than their ship while they slept. The math made his head hurt, and none of the explanations seemed adequate. The crystalline being called Resonance of Dawn asked Kyla to explain human history in more detail. Kyla hesitated, but then began describing Earth's wars. She talked about conflicts over resources and ideology and religion. She mentioned weapons that could destroy cities and the constant threat of total annihilation that had hung over humanity's final centuries. She tried to present it factually without emotion. The reaction was immediate and alarming. Several aliens backed away from the human delegation. Resonance of Dawn actually left the chamber entirely. The floating creature's liquid began churning violently. Even Click Thought Harmony seemed disturbed, though its alien face was hard to read. An awkward silence filled the room. Click thought Harmony finally spoke again, and Oracle translated carefully. Zephyr explained that the galaxy had been at peace for 9,000 years. Conflicts were resolved through arbitration councils and economic pressure. When disputes could not be settled peacefully, there were ritualized combats between champion ships with strict rules to minimize casualties. Total war of the kind Kayla described was considered a horror from the primordial past. No civilized species engaged in such behavior. Emma asked about the conflict they had detected. Click thought Harmony explained it was a territorial dispute with the Kryn Empire. The Kryn were aggressive by galactic standards but still followed the 9 covenants of civilized conduct. They would meet at a designated battlefield. They would fight according to established rules. The side that disabled 5 enemy ships first would win the disputed colonies. It was all very organized and proper. Jake listened and tried not to let his thoughts show on his face. These aliens had turned war into a sport. They had forgotten what real combat looked like. He wondered if they had forgotten because they had evolved past violence, or because they had simply gone so long without a serious threat. Either way, it represented a dangerous gap in their understanding. The Zephyr made an offer. They would provide humanitarian aid, fuel for the Valkyrie's reactor, food synthesizers, medical supplies, navigational data covering this entire region of space. In exchange, they asked only that humanity remain neutral in local affairs. They did not want an unknown factor disrupting the careful balance of power. The Kryn would make similar offers if contacted. Everyone wanted to know what humans would do. Kyla accepted the immediate aid but deferred on long-term commitments. She said humanity needed time to adjust to this new reality. Time to wake their remaining people. Time to find a world to settle. The Zephyr agreed and arrangements were made for the fuel and supplies to be transferred. The human delegation was given a tour of the station. They saw marketplaces where goods from 1,000 worlds were traded. They saw cultural centers where aliens shared art and music and philosophy. They saw living quarters and gardens and entertainment venues. It was all very clean and peaceful and organized. It made Jake deeply uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate. Emma noticed the defensive systems. She studied them with a tactical eye while pretending to admire the architecture. The weapons were powerful but slow to recharge. The targeting systems were sophisticated but predictable. The defensive formations assumed attackers would follow rules and approach from expected vectors. She said nothing, but Jake saw her making mental notes. When they returned to the Valkyrie, Lisa reported that the fuel transfer was complete. They had enough now to maneuver freely and even make a short, faster-than-light jump if needed. The food synthesizers would allow them to wake more crew without worrying about supplies. They had bought themselves time and options. Jake gathered his officers in private and asked for honest assessments. Emma said the station could be taken by a competent military force in under an hour. Peter said the aliens seemed genuinely peaceful but also genuinely naive about security. Kyla said the political situation was more complex than it appeared, with dozens of factions and competing interests. Lisa said their technology was impressive but oddly unbalanced, with massive advances in some areas and strange gaps in others. The discussion was interrupted by an alert from Oracle. A Kryn battle group had just entered the system. They were broadcasting a formal challenge to the Zephyr Concordat. They demanded 3 colony worlds be ceded to Kryn control. If the Concordat refused, they would meet in battle in 3 days at a location designated by ancient treaty. This was how galactic warfare worked. Scheduled and formal and polite. Jake decided they needed to see this battle for themselves. The galaxy was about to teach humanity what it had forgotten. But maybe humanity could teach the galaxy something too. The Kryn fleet arrived precisely on schedule. 17 heavy cruisers dropped out of faster-than-light, travel at the edge of the system, and immediately broadcast their formal challenge. Their commander, who called itself War Voice Eternal, spoke in a language that sounded like grinding metal. Oracle translated the message, and Jake had to read it twice to believe what he was seeing. War Voice Eternal demanded the Concordat surrender 3 colony worlds. If they refused, the matter would be settled through honorable combat. The battle would take place in 3 days at a location called the Proving Ground. Each side could bring up to 30 ships. Victory would go to whichever fleet disabled 5 enemy vessels first. All combatants would follow the 9 covenants which prohibited targeting of life support systems, crew quarters and engine cores. Disabled ships would withdraw with full honors. The winner would claim the disputed territory. It was all laid out like rules for a game. The Concordat accepted the challenge because apparently refusing was unthinkable. Click Thought Harmony explained to the humans that this was how civilized species resolved disputes that could not be arbitrated. Everyone understood the rules. Everyone accepted the outcome. It had worked this way for thousands of years. The system maintained order and prevented the kind of total warfare that had devastated primitive civilizations in the ancient past. Jake requested permission to observe the battle. The Zephyr agreed and seemed pleased by humanity's interest. They provided the Valkyrie with coordinates to a safe observation zone. The humans would be able to watch everything and record data. Many species sent observer ships to these contests. It was considered educational and entertaining. Emma spent the next 3 days studying every piece of data they could gather about both fleets. The Concordat assembled 30 ships from across their territory. Each vessel was enormous with crews numbering in the hundreds. Their weapons were particle beam cannons and kinetic accelerators that fired dense metal slugs at a fraction of light speed. Their shields could absorb tremendous punishment. On paper they looked formidable. The Kryn ships were similar in size and capability. They favored different weapon configurations, and their shields operated on slightly different principles, but the overall power levels were comparable. Emma ran simulations and determined the battle would be decided by minor tactical advantages and possibly luck. It would be close and it would take hours. What made Emma frown was how both fleets maneuvered. Their ships were fast for their size, but they moved in straight lines. They positioned themselves in formal geometric patterns. Their weapons had impressive range and power, but the firing cycles were slow. A particle beam would charge for 90 seconds, then fire for 10 seconds, then need another 90 seconds to recharge. Everything was ponderous and predictable. Ryan Foster, who had just been awakened from cryo, was shown the data. He had been their weapons officer on Earth, and he had overseen engagements against hostile ships during the Exodus. He watched the simulations of Concordat and Kryn combat, and then he started laughing. He laughed until tears ran down his face. When he finally stopped, he said these aliens were fighting like it was a parade, not a war. They had all the pieces, but none of the doctrine. The day of battle arrived, and both fleets moved to the Proving Ground. This turned out to be an empty region of space marked by ancient buoys. The area was clear of asteroids or planetary bodies. There was nowhere to hide and nothing to use as cover. It was deliberately chosen to be a fair and open battlefield. The Concordat ships formed a broad line facing the Kryn. Formation at a distance of 100,000 kilometers. Jake brought the Valkyrie to the observation zone along with ships from a dozen other species. Some were official military observers taking notes on tactics. Others were civilian vessels whose passengers treated this like a sporting event. There were even bookmakers running odds on the outcome. The whole thing felt surreal. The battle began with formal declarations broadcast on open channels. War Voice Eternal praised the courage of the Concordat. Click Thought Harmony acknowledged the strength of the Kryn. Both commanders wished each other honor and glory. Then the shooting started. The Concordat fired first with 15 ships unleashing particle beams simultaneously. The beams crossed the space between the fleets in seconds and impacted Kryn shields. Energy readings spiked as the shields absorbed the hits. The Kryn returned fire with their own weapons. Back and forth the two lines exchanged volleys like ancient sailing ships firing broadsides. It was methodical and stately and completely insane by human standards. Emma watched in disbelief. Both fleets were broadcasting their shield frequencies. Their targeting systems were active and easily detected. Their maneuvering was announced in advance. Everything was designed to be fair, which meant everything was predictable. There was no deception, no surprise. No exploitation of weakness. They were following rules that stripped away every advantage that clever tactics could provide. 2 hours into the battle, the first ship was disabled. A Concordat cruiser suffered shield collapse after absorbing sustained fire. According to the sensors, its weapons were offline and its propulsion was damaged. The ship broadcast its withdrawal and pulled back. Everyone honored this immediately. No one fired on the withdrawing vessel. The Concordat was down one ship, and the Kryn needed 4 more victories to win. Jake studied the patterns with a growing sense of understanding. This was not really war. It was conflict resolution through demonstration of resources. Both sides were showing they could afford to build and crew these massive ships. They were proving their industrial capacity and coordination. The actual fighting was secondary to the display. It was politics and economics wearing the costume of warfare. Another hour passed and 2 more ships were disabled. 1 Kryn and 1 Concordat. The score was now 2-1 in favor of the Kryn. The Concordat attempted a formation change and the Kryn countered. More shots were exchanged. Shield readings fluctuated. Minor damage accumulated. A 4th ship went dark and withdrew. It was a Concordat vessel. The gap was widening. Ryan had seen enough. He pulled up tactical controls and showed Jake what he would do in this situation. He would not sit at maximum range trading shots. He would close to point-blank distance where the long recharge cycles became a critical weakness. He would target sensors and communication arrays to blind and isolate enemy ships. He would use the mass of disabled vessels as cover. He would concentrate fire to overwhelm shields before they could recharge, instead of spreading damage evenly across the enemy line. He would do 100 things that apparently no one in this galaxy had thought of. The battle continued for another 90 minutes. 2 more Concordat ships were disabled. The Kryn achieved their 5 victories and War Voice Eternal broadcast the traditional declaration of triumph. The Concordat acknowledged defeat with honor. Both fleets began withdrawing. Medical ships moved in to assist damaged vessels. Observers discussed the battle and analyzed key moments. Several commentators praised War Voice Eternal's tactical brilliance. Jake listened to the analysis and heard nothing that impressed him. The Kryn had won because they had slightly better shield harmonics and their weapons had reached optimal firing temperature faster. It was a technical victory, not a tactical one. If this was what the galaxy considered warfare, then the galaxy was defenseless against anyone who actually knew how to fight. Back at the station, Click Thought Harmony invited the humans to a formal reception. The mood was somber because the Concordat had lost 3 colony worlds but not desperate. Losses were accepted as part of the process. There would be other challenges and other opportunities. The balance of power had shifted slightly but nothing fundamental had changed. This was normal. Jake made a decision. He requested a private meeting with Click Thought Harmony and the Concordat Leadership Council. They met in a secure chamber with only a handful of attendees. Kyla came to handle diplomacy. Emma came because Jake wanted her tactical perspective. Zephan brought 3 advisors and a military commander. Jake made his proposal. Let humanity handle the next Kryn incursion. The Concordat would provide resources to wake all of humanity's remaining sleepers and grant them an uninhabited system to colonize. In exchange, humanity would demonstrate their military capabilities. No official alliance. No treaty obligations. Just one battle to show what humans could do. The Zephan were skeptical. What could one small ship accomplish? The Valkyrie was barely frigate-sized by galactic standards. Its weapons were primitive. Its crew numbered only 300 even when fully awakened. The Kryn were bringing larger fleets with each victory. War Voice Eternal was already boasting about his next conquest. How could humans possibly help? Emma answered by showing them tactical analysis of the battle they had just watched. She pointed out every mistake, every missed opportunity, every predictable pattern. She explained what human doctrine would do differently. The Zephan listened and their doubt turned to unease. They were beginning to understand that their warfare was not actually warfare at all. Kyla supported the proposal. She argued that the Concordat needed new options. The old system was failing. The Kryn were becoming aggressive because they had learned they could win. Other species were watching and considering their own territorial sea. War Voice Eternal arrived at Void's Edge with 35 ships and absolute confidence. The Kryn commander had won 3 consecutive battles, and his fleet had grown with each victory. Smaller Kryn vessels had joined his banner, attracted by success and the promise of glory. His dreadnought was the largest ship in the region, and it bristled with weapons that had never tasted defeat. He broadcast his challenge with contempt barely concealed in the formal words. The Concordat informed War Voice Eternal that humanity would be their champion. The Kryn commander requested data on human capabilities and received only basic specifications for the Valkyrie. 1 small ship. Crew of 300. Primitive kinetic weapons and early generation energy systems. War Voice Eternal laughed. The sound was translated by Oracle as a grinding mechanical screech that made even the Zephon uncomfortable. He agreed to the terms. He even offered to limit his own fleet to just 10 ships to make it fair. It was an insult and everyone knew it. Jake declined the offer. Bring all 35 ships. Humanity would face them all. This declaration caused a stir across the galactic network. Observers who had planned to watch from a safe distance now scrambled to get closer. This would either be a historic demonstration or a tragic massacre. Billions tuned in to watch. The betting markets went wild with speculation. The Valkyrie moved to the battlefield alone. The ship looked tiny against the backdrop of space, even smaller when compared to the massive Kryn fleet. Assembling at the far end of Void's Edge, the asteroid field that gave the region its name drifted between the two forces. It was considered neutral territory, unsuitable for formal combat. Ships were supposed to avoid it and fight in clear space where honor could be observed. Jake had other plans. Emma sat at the tactical station with Ryan at weapons control. Lisa monitored engineering. Daniel stood ready in medical, though he prayed he would not be needed. The entire crew was at battle stations. They had drilled for this during the long approach. They had reviewed doctrine that was 10,000 years old but still sound. They had prepared in ways the galaxy could not imagine. War Voice Eternal opened communications. He spoke in formal challenge, praising humanity's courage and predicting their honorable defeat. He outlined the rules. No targeting of crew sections. No attacks on life support. First to disable 5 ships wins. The proving ground awaited. Would humanity meet him there like civilized beings? Jake responded with 2 words. No rules. Then he cut the communication and gave Emma the order to begin. The Valkyrie's engines fired not with the gentle acceleration the galaxy expected, but with a thrust that pushed the crew into their seats. Inertial dampeners compensated for forces that would have crushed unprotected bodies. The ship leaped forward like a bullet from a gun. The Kryn sensors screamed warnings. Something was moving toward them at impossible speeds. Their targeting systems tried to lock on, but the Valkyrie was already changing vector. It juked left, then right, then dove below the plane of battle. Emma was flying the ship like a fighter craft, not a warship. She used every trick human pilots had learned in 1,000 desperate battles. The Kryn had never seen anything like it. War Voice Eternal ordered his fleet to open fire. Particle beams lanced through space where the Valkyrie had been seconds before. Kinetic rounds followed predictable trajectories that Emma avoided with contemptuous ease. The Kryn weapons were powerful, but they were designed for targets that moved in straight lines. They could not track something that changed direction randomly and constantly. The Valkyrie entered the asteroid field. This was supposed to be impossible. The rocks were too dense and the velocities too high. But Emma threaded between asteroids with precision that made it look easy. She used them for cover and concealment. She broke line of sight with the Kryn fleet. Their sensors lost track of the small human ship. Ryan launched the first attack. Railgun rounds accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. They were not aimed at shields or armor. They targeted the sensor arrays on 3 Kryn cruisers. The arrays were external and unshielded because no one had ever thought to protect them. Metal slugs traveling at relativistic speeds tore through the delicate equipment like it was paper. 3 ships went blind in an instant. The Kryn tried to adjust. War Voice Eternal ordered his ships to tighten formation and create overlapping fields of fire. It was a reasonable response to a threat you could not track. It was also exactly what Jake had predicted. The tight formation meant ships were close together. It meant their shields were nearly touching. It meant one mistake would cascade into many. The Valkyrie emerged from the asteroid field at an angle the Kryn had not covered. Emma had circled around using the rocks to mask their movement. They appeared above and behind the Kryn formation at point-blank range by space combat standards. Ryan fired missiles. Simple chemical rockets with basic guidance systems. Technology that Earth had mastered centuries before the long sleep. The galaxy had long since moved past such primitive weapons and forgotten why they had been effective. The missiles were not targeting shields. They were targeting weapon hardpoints and maneuvering thrusters, small external systems that no one bothered to armor heavily. The warheads were conventional explosives, nothing exotic or advanced, but they hit with precision and timing that turned simplicity into devastation. 7 Kryn ships lost their main weapons. 4 lost maneuvering control. 2 collided as their damaged thrusters fired incorrectly. Shields designed to stop particle beams did nothing against physical impacts at these ranges. War Voice Eternal's broadcasts turned from confident to confused to angry. He demanded to know why humanity was not following the covenants. This was not honorable combat. This was not civilized warfare. Jake did not respond. He was too busy coordinating the next attack. The Valkyrie dove back into the asteroids. The Kryn tried to follow, but their massive ships could not maneuver through the field. 2 cruisers that attempted it suffered collision damage and had to withdraw. The human ship was using terrain in ways the galaxy had forgotten. Every asteroid was cover. Every rock was a tactical asset. The battle was three-dimensional in a way Kryn doctrine did not account for. Emma brought them out on a different vector. Ryan fired the railgun again. This time he targeted communication relays. Ships that could not talk to each other could not coordinate. The Kryn fleet was being systematically isolated and blinded. War Voice Eternal tried to maintain control, but his orders were not getting through. Individual commanders made their own decisions, and those decisions conflicted with each other. 20 minutes into the battle, and 10 Kryn ships were disabled. Not by the gentle standards of galactic combat, but truly crippled. Weapons gone. Sensors destroyed. Communications dead. Life support intact because Jake had ordered that protected. No crew casualties because that was not the point. But 10 massive warships reduced to helpless debris drifting in space. The remaining Kryn tried to retreat. War Voice Eternal broadcast an unconditional surrender. He offered to cede territory and pay reparations. He begged for mercy using words that had never been spoken in galactic warfare before. Jake considered letting them go. Then he thought about the colonists on worlds the Kryn had claimed. He thought about the Concordat ships that had fought honorably and lost. He thought about what would happen if he showed mercy to someone who would interpret it as weakness. The Valkyrie pursued. Emma drove the ship through maneuvers that redlined every system. Lisa rerouted power and bypassed safeties. Daniel prepared for casualties that never came. Ryan fired until the railgun's barrel glowed red and the missile racks were empty. The Kryn fleet disintegrated. Not destroyed, but disabled. Every ship dead in space. Crews alive but helpless. War Voice Eternal's dreadnought was the last to fall. It took sustained fire from multiple attack runs, but eventually its shields collapsed and its systems went dark. The battle had lasted 37 minutes. 35 Kryn ships disabled. 0 human casualties. The Valkyrie had taken hits. Armor was scorched and sections of hull were breached. But nothing critical was damaged. Lisa's engineering teams were already making repairs. In an hour they would be combat ready again. The galaxy watched in silence. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds tried to process what they had just witnessed. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was something else. Something ancient and terrible and brutally effective. The humans had not just won. They had demonstrated a level of combat capability that made every military force in known space obsolete. Click Thought Harmony contacted the Valkyrie immediately. Zephin's voice carried emotions that Oracle struggled to translate. Fear, awe, gratitude, horror, all mixed together. The Concordat wanted to talk. So did 17 other civilizations? Messages flooded in faster than Oracle could process. Alliance offers, technology requests, trade proposals, and underneath it all a question that no one wanted to ask directly. If humanity could do this to the Kryn, what could they do to anyone else? Jake ordered Emma to return to harmonious exchange. The crew was exhausted. The ship needed proper repairs, and they had a lot of explaining to do. As they left the battlefield, Jake looked back at the disabled Kryn fleet. Rescue ships were already moving in. The crews would be recovered. The ships would eventually be salvaged or repaired. 3 months after Void's Edge, the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened. The battle, as it was now simply called, had been analyzed by every military academy and strategic institute in known space. Experts dissected every maneuver. Scholars wrote papers on human tactical doctrine. Philosophers debated whether humanity's return was salvation or doom. And everywhere the old certainties were crumbling. The Kryn Empire was the first to change. War Voice Eternal had been removed from command and exiled in disgrace. The new leadership approached humanity not as enemies but as teachers. They wanted to learn. They understood that their old ways would not protect them anymore. If humans could fight like that, then others might learn to fight like that too. The only defense was knowledge. Jake met with Kryn commanders and found them humbled and desperate. He agreed to limited exchanges of information, not weapons technology but doctrine and theory. How to think about combat in 3 dimensions. How to use terrain. How to identify and exploit weakness. The Kryn learned quickly because survival demanded it. The Concordat honored their agreement. They granted humanity an entire system with 3 habitable worlds orbiting a stable yellow star. Jake named it New Terra because the name Earth belonged to a world none of them would ever see again. The remaining 10,000 sleepers were awakened gradually over the course of months. They emerged to find themselves the most feared and respected beings in the galaxy. It was a strange kind of fame built on one battle and a reputation humanity had never asked for. Lisa oversaw the construction of orbital infrastructure around New Terra. Shipyards took shape in space. Defensive platforms were positioned at strategic points. Communication arrays connected the 3 worlds and reached out to the wider galaxy. The Concordat provided resources and technical assistance, but they watched everything humanity built with nervous attention. Every human structure was designed with lessons from 10,000 years of warfare. Every system had redundancies and hidden capabilities. The galaxy was learning that humans built for war even in peace. Kyla became humanity's chief diplomat, and she had more work than any one person could handle. 17 civilizations wanted formal relations with humanity. Some offered alliance. Some offered trade. Some just wanted reassurance that humans would not turn their weapons against them. Kyla established the Terran Concordat, which was a mutual defense pact with 7 species who understood the new reality. The old order was dead. The galaxy needed structures that acknowledged the existence of real conflict. The agreement was controversial, but it attracted followers. Small nations that had been bullied by larger powers suddenly had protection. The balance of power was shifting. Emma trained the first mixed-species military unit. It was challenging work. Most aliens struggled with concepts that humans found intuitive. Aggressive maneuvers felt wrong to them. Deception seemed dishonorable. The idea of exploiting enemy weakness rather than meeting them in fair combat was alien to their thinking. But some learned. A few Kryn showed natural talent. Some of the crystalline beings called the Shardborn had tactical minds that could grasp complex 3-dimensional problems. Even a handful of Zephin overcame their cultural conditioning. Emma pushed them hard because she knew what was coming. The galaxy was relearning war, and that meant conflict was inevitable. Peter worked with alien scientists on projects that had nothing to do with weapons. Humanity had medical technology that could save lives, agricultural techniques that could feed billions, industrial processes that could lift civilizations. He shared these carefully and selectively. Not everything at once, because flooding the galaxy with human technology would cause disruption, but enough to show that humanity offered more than just violence. Jake supported this because he understood that fear alone was not a stable foundation for relations. People needed to see humans as partners, not just threats. Daniel made a discovery that changed how humans viewed their galactic neighbors. Working with alien medical teams, he noticed that none of them had stress responses like humans. Their fight-or-flight reflexes were muted or absent. Millennia of peace had literally changed their biology. Peter confirmed it with genetic analysis. Every species they encountered had evolved past their aggressive phases millions of years ago. Humanity was the anomaly, the species that left its homeworld while still carrying the scars of its violent nature. That was why human warfare was so effective and so terrifying. Humans were still capable of controlled aggression in ways the galaxy had forgotten. Not everyone welcomed humanity's presence. A coalition of isolationist species formed something called the Preservation Alliance. They argued that humanity should be quarantined, that human knowledge should be suppressed, that the old ways should be maintained at any cost. They did not advocate violence openly, but their rhetoric grew increasingly extreme. They spoke of humanity as a cancer, a regression to barbarism, a threat to galactic civilization. Jake monitored their transmissions with growing concern. He recognized the pattern: fear and rhetoric leading to action. It was how wars started. The first test came from an unexpected direction. A species called the Ven, who had been neutral, suddenly launched raids against Concordat shipping. They used tactics clearly inspired by human doctrine: hit-and-run attacks, targeting of vulnerable systems, exploitation of predictable patrol routes. It was crude and incomplete, but it showed that others were learning. Emma took a squadron of 3 ships, including the Valkyrie, and hunted down the Ven raiders. She did not destroy them. She disabled them, captured them, and delivered them to Concordat authorities. The message was clear: humanity would not tolerate chaos. Learning to fight meant learning when to fight and when to stop. 1 year after awakening, Jake gathered his senior staff for a critical meeting. Ryan reported that 17 species were now actively studying human military doctrine. Emma noted that 3 minor conflicts had been resolved quickly because both sides understood what escalation meant. Kyla presented diplomatic challenges. The Preservation Alliance was gaining support, and some species were developing weapons, specifically designed to counter human tactics. Lisa showed data on New Terra's development. The 3 worlds were becoming self-sufficient. More ships were being built. The human population was growing. Daniel shared his research on alien biology and psychology. His conclusion was sobering. The species they had encountered were not weak or cowardly. They had simply evolved past the need for violence. Humanity represented something they could barely comprehend: a species still carrying its capacity for organized aggression into the space age. That made humans uniquely dangerous, but it also made humans uniquely capable of understanding and managing conflict. Jake made a decision that would define humanity's role in the galaxy. They would not hide what they were, but they would use their nature carefully. Humans would be the galaxy's protectors, the reminder that peace required strength. Not conquerors, but guardians. The sword that stayed sheathed unless needed. It was a role that carried enormous responsibility. Humans would need to be disciplined and restrained. They would need to prove they could be trusted with the power they possessed. A ceremony was organized on New Terra. Representatives from 40 species gathered to sign what became known as the New Covenant. It was a document that acknowledged the reality of conflict while establishing guidelines to minimize it. Not the naive rules of ritualized combat, but genuine protocols for diplomacy and escalation prevention. Rules for when force was justified and how it should be applied. Rules that recognized some species could fight more effectively than others and that this imbalance required careful management. Jake stood before the assembled delegates and spoke about humanity's history. He did not hide Earth's wars or pretend humans were peaceful. He talked about the mistakes his species had made, the horrors they had inflicted on each other, the lessons learned in blood and fire. And he talked about why those lessons mattered. Peace was not the absence of conflict. Peace was the wisdom to handle conflict without destroying yourselves. The galaxy had forgotten that wisdom because they had been safe for so long. Humanity remembered because they had never been safe. The new covenant was signed by species who understood that the old order could not return. Some signed reluctantly. Some signed enthusiastically. The Preservation Alliance refused to sign and condemn the entire process. But enough civilizations agreed to make it meaningful. A new framework for galactic relations was taking shape, one that acknowledged strength and violence as factors that had to be managed rather than ignored. As the ceremony concluded, Jake walked to the viewing platform that looked out over New Terra's primary city. Lisa joined him and they stood in silence for a moment. The city was growing rapidly, human architecture mixing with alien designs, ships from a dozen worlds in orbit overhead. It looked like hope and possibility. It also looked fragile. Lisa asked if Jake thought they had made the right choice. Coming out of hiding, demonstrating what humans could do, pushing the galaxy to change. Jake was honest. He did not know. Maybe they should have stayed hidden, found a quiet corner of space and lived apart. But that was not really an option. The galaxy had already changed. The Kryn or someone like them would have continued pushing. The old seas